All right, Ben, welcome to the Project Mindfully Outdoors Campfire. This is one of those conversations that I'm really looking forward to. I'm really excited about because we've traveled a lot of the same trails as far as experiencing those moments that impact you so much that it's really, really hard to let them go and work past them. In order to do so, we've stepped into some different environments, some cultural experiences that have taught us things that we've been able to craft into our own journey and experience to help ourselves, and then be able to utilize that skill set to help other people. I think that's a beautiful journey.
Right. Mhm. Definitely.
So so let's do this a little bit. Let's jump into the background. Some of those talk to me about some of those traumas and experiences that led you to undertake this journey.
I think initially what propelled me was the fact that I was, even from early childhood, drawn to Native Americans. And I just had this profound fascination that at the age of 14, when I began to hear accounts of some of the traditional Native doctors, at that age, I was just thinking to myself, if ever given the opportunity, this is what I'll do. And the descriptions of the vision quest and the kinds of otherworldly experiences they would have, and the phenomenal healing gifts power they possessed. And so by the time I was 15, I was already saving money to planning to make my exit. And at 17, I took off on my own. I landed among a community of predominantly Kiowa Indians. There was Comanches to the south, and Cheyenne and Arapaho situated to the north, and Caddo, Wichita, and Delaware uh, to the east. And but I made it as far as Oklahoma. I was thinking I would head to Arizona. I was still in high school, thinking that at least I'll finish high school. But my car died as soon as I got to Oklahoma, and it was good that it did because I felt a strong resonance with the Kiowa people, and and I'd be sitting up all night in peyote meetings with the native elders. They, for some reason, made an exception for me. It's one of my younger friends, said to the elderly man who had taken him in to raise him, said, "Hey, Dad, Ben wants to go in the peyote meetings," and so it was thought for a few seconds and said, "Okay," and there was some pushback from some of the other elders, but this elderly man, Jack, they deferred to him, and so when they push back, and he just says, "This one is different. Let him come in." And so they did. And it was during the peyote meetings that I met my mentor, Horace Daukei, who is one of the last surviving traditional doctors among the Kiowa people. Horace is definitely the last of the extraordinarily powerful doctors. He possessed paranormal abilities, and he would, and initially I was afraid that he would not even allow me to attend the peyote meetings because I'm white. But I remember one night when he was conducting a meeting, and I was hoping to get in, and he was standing across the hallway in another bedroom talking to this elderly man, Jack, who first took me into the peyote meetings. And he stopped and he stared intently. I could feel, his gaze was so piercing. I could feel him looking right through me. And I think he knew in that instance that I would apprentice from him. And And then a year later, when my grades were starting to drop in college, largely because I wasn't doing what I needed to do with my life at that point, I decided to approach him and physically shaking, I was asking, saying to him, I want to learn to do what you're doing. And he says, what are you doing this weekend? Can you start fasting? So I drove down to the Wichita Mountains, didn't eat or drink next 2 days and nights. That time, I can't really tell much of anything happened other than it was his way of making sure that I was serious, and afterwards heading out to New Mexico and where he lived on the Navajo reservation with his wife. And that's where the apprenticeship began. Again, a lot of these native doctors possess paranormal abilities, and he would do things like take the end of a feather, physically shoot it into my body. And I would go into something akin to a seizure. So he would do that. And when you receive these transmissions of power, it's not enough to just run with the ball. It's expected that you earn the right to work with them. And so he'd have me go on the vision quest, which is typically was about 4 days and nights fasting with no food and water. And I did miss some time in my 20s, but started up again at 31. And so since 1993, I've been going twice a year, spring and fall. And there was a lot of trauma in my background growing up, physical and emotional abuse. And it was initially that resonance I felt with Native people that drew me into this. And I didn't realize when I started going back to do the vision quest that it would address the trauma. I was just thinking that, hey, I go to the mountain and I'll develop a lot of these gifts and capabilities like so many of these powerful Native doctors have done over the centuries. And yes, I have received other gifts of healing, what Native people refer to as medicine. But there are many instances I'd be on the mountain and I'd feel these forces or beings descend into my body. And at times it's like a near-death experience where portions of my life are flashing before my eyes. And I'd have a lot of these traumatic events, some of which I had no recollection, and all that would be making its way back into my conscious awareness and reliving those experiences, all the vivid sensory impressions, all the highly charged emotions attached to them. And I'd feel that presence working within me to enable me to digest both those lived experiences and all the highly charged emotions attached to them. So I'd come out the other side and I could feel much of that traumatic wounding pertaining to those issues systematically over time being dismantled. And while simultaneously building this new foundation that, because a lot of times we experience these traumatic events, especially earlier in our lives, and there's a arresting or stopping of our development. We fail to develop certain resources or capabilities because of it.
See, I'm listening to you talk, and I'm loving the the story that you're sharing with us, and then the point that you stop is with those traumas that we experience, and we all go through them. It's almost like we hit this little break in our development system because that moment holds us there, and we discover that in order to continue our life, we have to develop a sense of survival. We have to just simply live here in that situation because, and I know I'm guilty of this at different stages in my life, those traumatic experiences, they block, number one, the ability to develop the vocabulary to understand them.
Mhm.
and also to work through them. So when you stay right there in that moment, it becomes safe. You're comforting yourself. But as you continue to go down the road of life, in the back of your head, hope starts to speak to you. It starts to tell you, there's a lot more out there than what you're doing right now. And you got to sort of look back to your childhood, really, to find the motivation and the inspiration to pick up that little bit of shelter that you made in survival mode there to continue to go forward. And I like drawing on the analogy of when we learned how to walk as a child, that process. We sat still in our mother's lap until finally that voice told us there's something more out there. Pick up your head and taught us to start crawling. And then we learned that based off of hope that there's a broader view of the world around us. So then we stood up against the table, and that standing up triggered hope one more time to cause us to take our first step. We fell countless times before we learned how to walk, but we didn't know any different. We didn't know about the other side of life, the challenges, the struggles, the pain. So being able to chart your way back into that, no matter how you get there, is that ability, getting back to picking up camp and starting to move forward and explore the wilderness again.
Now, one of the factors to consider here is that for many of us, we've never been taught how to work effectively with our own authentic emotional responses. The fact that a lot of the emotions that arise in response to these various stressful, upsetting, or traumatic events are so disconcerting, so uncomfortable, even excruciatingly painful, and we tend to avoid or suppress or deny or disconnect from the impressions of those experiences that we internalize and all the emotions that arise thereof. And in doing so, there's a numbing or disconnect. We're disconnecting from this aspects of our experience. We're shutting down our authentic emotional responses to what we live through. And when we hold these or carry these traumatic wounds within our bodies, there's a tendency that we tend to attract people and situations that reflect that initial wounding. We stage these reenactments. It's repetition, compulsion. And the fact that we continue to suppress or avoid or disconnect emotionally prevents many of us from ever really learning or getting the lesson or healing from the actual traumas themselves. In many instances, we're digging the groove ever deeper. It's a reinforcement. And so it's so crucial for us to find that courage within ourselves. We may not feel very courageous initially, but to the best of our ability, it's so important for us to face the issues head on with what resources we possess and to do the deep level processing of our emotions. Part of that, and there's a practice that I teach people, is that when you can bring that person or situation, the issue or concern to the forefront of your awareness, hold it firmly in your awareness. And as you do so, notice how you feel in response to what's happening or who you're seeing. What are the feelings? What are the sensations? So that's step one. And two, uh, where are these feelings situated in your body? Are they in your chest cavity, down in your abdomen, a little higher in your solar plexus, towards your back? Where are they? And then bring your full awareness into these feelings, wherever you experience them, in your body. And as you do so, just breathe very softly, very deeply. You're not trying to change the feelings. You're not trying to make them go away. You're not you're not attempting to breathe them out. You're not sprinkling fairy dust. You just let them be what they are. And you keep breathing softly and deeply from the depth of these feelings and sensations. And as you do so, there's this innate healing intelligence residing within your body and mind. And these as this innate healing intelligence begins to work, it facilitates this process through which you begin to digest and assimilate both the lived experiences and your authentic emotional responses. And so emotions, feelings such as anger, frustration, rage, resentment, anxiety, fear, sadness, grief, you stay with these feelings, they do go through a transformation. Now, it depends on what's going on, what event or what circumstances are playing out. Because if you're in the midst of a breakup or someone has just ghosted you, these feelings probably not going to go away very quickly and really take some time. Someone's stringing you along and you're already struggling with abandonment issues and you just don't know how it's going to play out. And that could be excruciating, but as these feelings are coming up, you're breathing softly and deeply. I often sit down for easily an hour, 90 minutes, 2 hours or more, sometimes 3. And we don't always have the luxury to do that. Life demands a lot of us, but even as I'm going about the day, what I have to do there during the day, I could be commuting, but I stay connected to what I'm feeling, and I continue to breathe from the depth of those feelings and bodily sensations. I keep following them. I had a running joke with myself years ago because when I was still carrying so much trauma, and you're breathing into the depths of all those excruciatingly painful emotions, which that's what comes up when you're carrying enormous trauma, it puts you into quite an altered state. For instance, you see some of these people who have suspended themselves from hooks. Like if you spend time in South Asia, places like Sri Lanka, and some of the Tamil people who, worship the deity Murugan, the son of Shiva. Um, uh, and they're suspended by hooks sometimes. And they go through this kind of ritual process. And I'd look into their eyes and you could see that they kind of transcend that pain. They move through the pain and they're in this profoundly altered state. And there's a way that when you go through the depth of the pain, suffering, the trauma that you're carrying, because you're breathing and you're staying connected to what you feel, that you move through it. But it could put you in this profoundly altered state. So I had this running joke with myself, like, okay, what drug am I on today? Now, some people can feel pretty overwhelmed by these emotions that arise. And especially as I work with people with histories of trauma, those who are not all that stable to begin with, who are easily overwhelmed by the all-consuming and at times excruciatingly painful emotions, I'll take them out and have them do the walking meditation. That's something I developed my own version when I was in my late 20s, because after being ghosted, one night I couldn't stand being holed up in the apartment anymore. So I just took off walking. I was living in Kansas City at the time. And I found that I could drop down into all that pain, be breathing from the depth of it. And as I kept breathing, it's like the emotions that normally stayed bottled up, those emotions, because they're so uncomfortable, they don't move very readily. But what I found is that they begin to expand, extend outwards from my body. And we have this electromagnetic field, something called an aura, that expands around our body. And I could feel all that emotion extended outward. And not only that, it was like circulating through the electromagnetic field or aura. And also, I realized that the Earth itself has its own electromagnetic field, and that the Earth's electromagnetic field was filtering these painful emotions that were surfacing, and it would make it a lot easier by neutralizing those emotions, diffusing the intensity of them. It made it a lot easier to just cycle through them. And so for a couple of years, I'd be going out, walking for miles, usually 2, 3 hours a day. And it helped me to cycle more and more of that, traumatic stress, those emotions that could at times be quite overwhelming or excruciatingly painful. Cycle them through my system. It just made it a lot easier to get through all that.
I'm thinking to kind of soften that and build on that even a little bit and go back to the analogy of when we learned how to walk, is you're starting to not only make peace and make comfort with yourself based off of all these different things that have affected your mindset and your perception of who you are, but you're also building that ability to comfort yourself the
Mm-hmm.
same way that as a child you would fall down and your mother would pick you up and comfort you through the pain. So as you start moving through that process and you become a better friend to yourself and you learn to tap into those emotions and let them expand, it almost becomes not only intriguing and amusing to watch the way that the further those emotions grow away, the context of those emotions changes. So the way that you will go from feeling anger and resentment toward this one individual spot, the more distance that you put physically between the two of you and you allow that emotion to grow, it becomes more of an understanding, a sense of compassion. It leads to the forgiveness that you need in order to start to let all of those things go, not just on a physical, I can see what I'm doing sort of level, but also on that deeper rooted emotional plane.
So one of the challenges I find, I experienced it myself, and I see this with so many other people, is that when we live through these traumatic events, is that they become hardwired into our body or mind or brain. It's, we internalize those lived experiences and all those highly charged emotions, and it leaves these profound and lasting imprints. It alters the neurostructure of the brain itself, and the biochemical makeup of the brain. And in many instances, that becomes habituated. And so we relive. One, we tend to attract the same types of people and experiences repeatedly. For instance, you see this often, individuals tend to draw into their life the same types of individuals that hurt and abuse, abandon, or reenact a lot of that early emotional wounding, and it elicits these incredibly excruciatingly painful, devastating emotional responses. And that can be torturous. And sometimes on our own, we don't possess the resources that would enable us to fully heal these wounds. They're so deeply entrenched, and we're fixated within this context, and it keeps reenacting itself. And I was doing as much practice as I could on my own, but I was struggling. in many ways, because these patterns continue to reenact themselves. And there are times where there are some gifted healers I had the opportunity to work with, one from Brazil and another from the Philippines. And what I found when I had the opportunity to get sessions with them was that it started to dismantle or deconstruct some of these configurations that were so deeply entrenched in my makeup. But the problem is they didn't come around very often. There are very few people working on this level. And I needed much more intervention. I was suffering terribly. And initially, as I said, I assumed that, going to the vision quest, that like these other native doctors for centuries, that's how they developed these extraordinarily powerful gifts of healing that enable to facilitate the healing of a wide range of physiological health-related issues. And as I've gone dozens of times to the mountain, yes, that has happened, receiving those gifts that, again, what they refer to as medicine. But what I didn't understand, though, is that as I go through the vision quest, that these forces or beings that would descend into my body, when I was reliving these traumatic experiences on the mountain and these near-death-like experiences, that it was dismantling those previous traumas, building this new foundation that hadn't developed before. And so I'd come out the other side feeling much lighter. And the way I would respond, instead of reacting based upon those old traumas, I was responding in completely different ways. Didn't happen just all at once in one vision quest, but repeatedly going through the vision quest, it kept dismantling more of that trauma, building this new foundation. And here I've been in practice now for 35 years. I'm older than I look, and actually began my apprenticeship, was it 41 years ago? And so for all these years, I've been working with people, and I was teaching classes too on a weekly basis for over 10 years, up until the COVID pandemic shut all that down. And and thousands, probably at least 10,000 people went through my classes. I probably worked with at least 4,000 people individually. But I could see just so often, so many people have experienced this traumatic wounding of one form or another. And there are some things we can do to facilitate our healing, like these practices that I teach people, because I want to give people the tools that they need that are going to facilitate healing within their bodies and mind. But at a certain point, we also need intervention to facilitate that healing that we cannot fully do on our own. And that's where, for instance, I said I worked with some of these gifted healers, and the fact that there were limited opportunities to find individuals working on these levels. It's not something you're going to get from one of these people who's gone through 3 weekend workshops and calls himself a blah, blah master healer. That's bullshit. I mean, it takes years of training. There's an apprenticeship one goes through. This, like among the Native Americans, these extraordinarily powerful doctors, they take one or maybe just a few apprentices, transmit those healing gifts, usually towards the end of their life, and then you're expected to go through the vision quest. Again, you're not going to get this through a workshop or series of workshops. I mean, it's a very arduous path to follow. But anyway, these days, there's very few people working on this level. You still find more of it in places like maybe Brazil, other parts of South America, Indonesia, Malaysia, but the lure of modern day life, all the conveniences and the distractive technologies of smartphones and social media, it's just drawing people more and more away from these practices. And again, it's so intensive what one has to go through that few people are going to follow this path. I know that in my own experiences, I work with people individually that, you know, I work as a conduit, as these native doctors have done for centuries. And so these other forces or beings work through me, and they go in where people are carrying a lot of these traumatic wounds, where they've reenacted these patterns in their relationships, abandonment, rejection, repeatedly attracting individuals into their lives who abuse and abandon them and create just horrible suffering. And, you know, in the devastation of a breakup, other traumas, people who have suffered childhood physical, sexual, verbal, emotional abuse, a combination thereof. And so it'll go in systematically in stages, and it's like dismantling that trauma, these traumatic wounds, that taking those lived experiences, they go into a profoundly deep altered state, and they're digesting those lived events, digesting all those highly charged emotions. It's reconfiguring that biochemical balance in the brain and facilitating those changes within the brain's neurostructure. And so working with some of these individuals who are initially, you know, maybe they're experiencing flashbacks, just tendency to overreact, you know, having these rather extreme reactions and unable to contain their emotions, and they're just not all that functional, and their physical health is suffering as a result of the trauma that is held within their body. And it's, again, it's neutralizing those highly charged emotions. They're digesting that, digesting the lived experiences. And they come out the other side and they're feeling much calmer, more at ease. As they're able to digest those traumatic lived experiences and all these highly charged emotions, new resources begin to emerge. They develop new capabilities. So there's a whole level of healing that one experiences when you have the opportunity to work with someone such as myself and these other native or indigenous healers. The sad thing is that there's so few people operating on these levels anymore. I know there's a lot of people who've gone through these, you know, weekend workshops, you know, weekend workshop master healers. And it's not my intention to put anyone or anything down. It's just, it's like the whole new agey thing tends to trivialize everything which it comes into contact.
Yes,
And there are these ancient
absolutely.
traditions throughout the world, but people don't understand that, you know, it often involves years of intensive training. One doesn't just go through workshops and all of a sudden you're a shaman. It's just absolute nonsense. You know, it's years of apprenticeship, and you go through things like the vision quest, you know, again, like fasting the 4 days and nights alone in the mountains without food and water. So it's a lot more intensive. You know, there's a lot of people just making money out there, you know, teaching workshops, and, you know, so it's kind of sad. A lot of the ancient traditions are being bastardized. So it loses its integrity. Um, so
See,
if
I really like where you're going there. I'm sorry, I got to stop you at that point because you speak directly to that man or woman sitting in their car underneath that terrible rainstorm that makes them realize when they look in the rearview mirror, it's time to face up and it's time to walk that path of healing.
Mhm.
You get in like almost a frenzy where you see 9,000 different people that offer you these things based off of exactly that, the half-assed knowledge that they think they have.
Mhm.
And in the end, for them, it's wrapped around the buzzwords and it's wrapped around the cash grab. In fact, it was
Mhm.
funny because last night I mentioned before we hit recording or before we hit start how I've set up all night, was putting together a bunch of episodes for the podcast and whatever. And through social media, I had one of those people reach out to me
Mhm.
and they're like, I'm going to give you this reading, whatever. And I'm like, oh, okay, great. Sounds like a plan. Let's see what happens. And then it was, well, before we go any further, you got to pay me. I'm like, I don't even know what you can do for one. And then she goes, well, I can tell you all these answers to your career. I can tell you all these different things that are going to happen. Okay, well, if I was meant to know those things right now, from my experience in the context that I know, an animal or some other sign would come through and point me in that direction, right? I
Mhm.
wouldn't have to pay some total stranger $100 to get these mystical answers. And it's that awareness that I love that you touched on. Understanding that, yes, there's hope when you're sitting there looking in that rear view mirror going, man, it's time to find a new direction. Let me take one of these off the beaten path courses and apply myself to it. But you got to slow the frenzy down because you got to look at the people that you're reaching out and the people that you're bringing into your circle, because there's a million and one people out there, whether it's a personal relationship that's trying to come in, a business opportunity, or even in this case, the spiritual healing and the things that are becoming so common-based nowadays. If they don't have those true, authentic principles behind it, like you mentioned earlier, the work to earn that ability to do those things. If you don't have that behind it, you're really going nowhere. You may as well just sit there in the car and continue to stare at the mirror and let the rain pour down on you. At least that way you're protecting yourself.
Now, traditionally, among the Native American tribes, at least those that I was familiar with, I can't speak for all tribes because I'm not familiar with the practices or traditions of the tribes in the Northeast. Those, say, among the Iroquois Confederacy, I don't know their practices, are those in places like Florida, the Seminole, or the Creek, and Chickasaw, Choctaw, are in the Northwestern tribes. I don't even know their names, actually. But among the Plains tribes that I was familiar with, the traditional doctors, they did not charge a fee, but people understood that there is a value to what was being offered to them, to that intervention that was provided. And so Native people actually gave generously according to their means. If they were destitute, just they were very poor, they might give something like the equivalent of maybe some loaves of bread. They didn't have bread in those days, but just for example, or a week's worth of groceries or food. But those who were well off might give considerably more. I don't know exactly how it would break down, but let's say maybe they'd give a horse or something, um, something of
I think
considerable value. Hold on. And and so as I was beginning my practice, I wasn't charging initially. And I remember in the beginning, I went out with one evening with three men, and I'd worked with the girlfriend of one, and I'd actually worked on it, one of the three men directly. And I was just finishing college at the time, and we're sitting in this restaurant, and they were eating, and I didn't have enough money to eat, and no one offered to buy me anything to eat. And I'm just sitting there going hungry. And and so yeah, I started charging. And even my mentor, Horace, he lived up in the Four Corners region of New Mexico on the Navajo Reservation. And he got a call at one point and dropped everything and drove all the way to Oklahoma. It's a 12-hour drive, and he sat up all night in a peyote meeting to work with someone. Yeah. And they gave $40. And that $40, that's not even enough to pay for gas between, not even one way, between that Farmington, Shiprock, New Mexico area all the way to Carnegie, Anadarko, Oklahoma. It's like, so he got burned pretty bad. It cost him. And so some people can, and you could call me judgmental. I don't care. I don't buy into this kind of new ageisms, but some people can be idiots. They'll just take advantage of you. And so if we don't charge a fee for services we provide, when we're providing something of great value, we have to be taking care of those of us, because in order to do this work, for me to go to the Vision Quest, for instance, just for example, it cost me the airfare and rent a car and Airbnb. There's a lot of logistics for me just getting to the mountain, and that could easily run 1,000 or 1,200. Also, I have to pay rent and buy food and clothing. So, you know, I don't just live in the ether somewhere. It's like I have to support myself. And so, you go to a physician, a conventional Western allopathic physician, to provide medical services for you. Those individuals are not just donating their services to you. You pay, and you pay extraordinary amounts of money. One time I got a UTI, really bad urinary tract infection, and it ended up costing me about $2,000. And it's like it didn't resolve the issue. And I had to do all this research and figure out what it took to get rid of that, get that out of my system. And last time I saw a doctor for that, you have to go back on the antibiotics. It's like, there is no way I'm putting that shit back in my body. I'm not taking any more of that. And I wrote an article, it's on my website, about getting rid of urinary tract infections. I don't remember the exact title, but it's on my website if you look up my name in urinary tract infections. And I detail what I did, and I got that out of my system. But yeah, it's, any service, whether you work with an accountant, an attorney, a physician, we live in this world. And so any provider of services, there is a fee. And, I'm so generous with my time. I'm doing 3-hour sessions, and I'm probably way undercharging. A lot of people tell me I'm way undercharging for what I give. But I'm trying to find that balance, because the wounding that people carry emotionally, a lot of the traumas people carry, the physiological health related issues. I'm working with people with IBS, Crohn's disease, colitis, people injured in automobile accidents who have suffered heart attack and stroke, traumatic brain injuries, wide range of issues. And sometimes it takes considerable time to get in there and resolve those issues. And so I'm doing the best I can to find that balance. It's like, okay, I do have to support myself, but at the same time, I'm genuinely concerned. I do this work because I care about people. I want to see individuals heal and thrive and live their best lives. So it's like, okay, charge enough so I could support myself, but at the same time, make it affordable enough so that people can get the work they need and be able to heal themselves. But it ends up, I see people spend thousands of dollars through the conventional Western allopathic medical system, and a lot of times it's not addressing their needs, and they're still carrying the traumatic wounding, or they're still suffering the physiological health issues, autoimmune disorders, or whatever, and then I treat them and work with them, and they're recovering, and I've basically made chump change compared to what they've paid through the conventional medical system. Yeah, so yes, there is, yeah, there needs to be compensation for services provided.
So I got to ask you this because I know that as I built my in-person program and business, I
Mm,
struggled a lot with that. You know,
mm,
the idea of you're paying me for this service.
mm,
And in reality, it's not the service, it's the experiences
mm.
that, and I had to make that transition in my head. Did you walk me through that process? Was that a struggle for you in the beginning?
Yeah, because a lot of times, especially when you come from a background where there's a lot of trauma and you're just like, you're subjected to whatever verbal and physical assault, and there's a low sense of self-worth, even self-hatred, and you don't feel all that great about yourself. You don't feel too worthy or deserving. And, so there's a tendency you undervalue yourself and what contribution you've made. And, and in some ways, it's still a struggle because, again, quite a few people have told me that you don't charge enough for what you're providing. And when I see what people have spent through conventional medical avenues, what I see people have spent through decades of psychotherapy, years or decades. And there's a woman that I worked with, for instance, molested by her father, stepfather, both also physically abused, was in psychotherapy for a decade, and there were years of completely blacked out, no memory, no recollection. First session, very first session, she's recovering the memories. And they had put psychotherapy on hold because she and the psychotherapist had agreed that, well, they'd gone as far as they could. And then that first session, it's all coming back, recovering the memories. It was pretty intense when that happened because she was crying profusely. And this is when I was just beginning my practice and not knowing what else to do. I sat there caressing her back because I really felt for the suffering that she was experiencing. And she continued to work with me for quite a few years until I moved out of Kansas City. Well, I would go back and visit periodically. So that's, yeah, I'd say she worked with me for, oh no, maybe 10 or 15 years total. And there's actually a video on YouTube where she and I are having this conversation. Again, I don't remember the exact title, but something about healing sexual trauma. And, but where was I going with that? People will go through these conventional modalities and they'll pay extraordinary amounts of money over time. And so it's to the best of my ability, just determining, like, okay, here in this, you, know, you see what services, the valuation that is placed upon different services. You see the results produced that people are getting for those various services. And then as I'm working with people and I see the results, and are often far greater than what they've achieved through other means. And so I'm trying to take into account, well, what can people afford? And I want to be reasonable with them at the same time. It's like, well, I do have to support myself. And also considering that I do lengthy sessions, they're often about 3 hours in length when I do the in-person sessions, that is. If I work over the phone, if I work remotely, I can't do quite as much remotely. but I charge a bit less because those sessions are shorter, and I'm just, according to what I can provide. So yeah, it's something, it's still a bit of a challenge. I'd like to, be able to receive, the value of what's provided, especially in relation to what I see people receiving through other approaches that they've tried. Is that making sense, what I'm saying?
It makes sense, and it also makes me consider the fact that yes, there's the monetary payment that we gain out of this that is required to live, and that's pretty much where we set the value and the focus on, because there's that love and there's that desire to help our fellow man based off of the experiences that we've had. But on the same token, I know from what I do, and I'm sure you can relate with this statement, there's the unmonetized payment that we receive. And that's the satisfaction of touching somebody's life, which also, on the flip side of that coin, is the progression of our healing journeys and our process.
Now I hear what you're saying there, but there's a balance with this, because what I find in working with people individually, as much as I give, and if there's not a fair compensation, it can be extremely draining. All this time and all this effort, and the fact that I have, again, pay rent, and that I need to do my own continued training, my own ongoing journey of healing. And as I said, for me to go back to the mountain for the vision quest, that can easily add up to $1,000, $1,200. Hopefully it's not going to be more. But with the greed of like the rental car companies, it used to be able to having my own insurance, but the baseline, I used to be able to get it for about a week, even sometimes under 200 or maybe 230 or 50. And now it's like to get a rental car for a week, and those blood-sucking corporate entities are just like, could easily be $500. But to give and give, and I give a lot as I work with people, and without the compensation, you just feel extraordinarily drained, and it can get way out of balance, and you're just being taken advantage of by people. And the other thing too is, if people don't, people understand valuation has a monetary aspect to this. And if you just give your services, people are just like, don't take it seriously. They take you for granted. And it's like, oh, there's something that's computing in their brain, like, yeah, I just got this for free. It must not really be worth anything. And so there is this valuation that is applied to services or goods based on the a price affixed to that value or service. So it's some psychological dynamic or whatever. I don't know what else to call it, but there is a reason. I mean, there is a need for you know affixing the value and determining, and that's something that we have to, partly based on the results produced. If a service is not affecting substantial change, then, because there are a lot of things out there that I don't think are very effective. I mean, when I was in my mid to late 20s and I was suffering as a result of the wounding, the traumas that I experienced growing up. And yeah, I tried a lot of different practices and modalities, and and some things were not very effective, and yet they were expensive, but I wasn't really seeing results, and I tended to be thorough. I mean, some things I could tell right off. It's like it's not really doing anything. Now, I find it can be challenging working with people initially, because some people, because of the emotional wounding, the fact they've never really dealt with their emotions other than just suppressing or self-medicating with alcohol, other recreational drugs. Maybe they're on pharmaceuticals, antidepressants, anti-anxiety meds. Some people, the meds may be the best known solution, especially if they are contending with some psychotic disorders where they would be like a danger to themselves and others. Well, maybe the meds are the best known solution, but I also find that there are a lot of people who are on antidepressants, anti-anxiety meds, because they've never learned to work effectively with their emotions. And so they're overwhelmed by their own emotional responses. And so they medicate. But the concern with that is when we're on these medications is that it, to some degree, we register what is occurring, the events that are stressful or upsetting, distressing. We have somewhat of an emotional response, but it's like the circuit is somehow disrupted so that that emotional response doesn't register consciously. But what I'll see as I work with a lot of these individuals is that there's all this residual of all these unprocessed emotions that are held in the body. There's a woman that I was working with for some years that had breast and uterine cancer. And as I worked with her, I mean, it kept her in remission. But there is this backlog of residual in her body of, like, she was on antidepressants for like 16 years, and there's this just thick, congealed, um, all this stagnant emotion that had accumulated, and the clinical term is lack of effect. I mean, she had this flatness to her demeanor. It was like talking with a piece of cardboard. Now, after working with her some time, she became expressive. She developed that full range of affect or emotion, and as again, sessions kept her in remission for all this time we were working. You know, she got COVID, and this was in the earlier stages of the pandemic, and people were dying like flies, and the COVID killed her. And was very sad for the loss, because we worked consistently. I also thought of her as a friend, but I think at least 4 or so people I knew died of COVID during those early stages. Probably more, because thinking that at least 10,000 people have gone through my classes, and classes I conducted in New York and Boston. So I assume there are other people that were lost during that time as well.
As we start to come toward the end of our conversation, I want to thank you for what's been a very enlightening, special conversation that achieved a couple of different things. Not only does it raise the hope and awareness that healing and real growth is possible, but it also expands the picture of the mindset that we're looking for. And it brings it back to the word awareness, because you got to be aware of where you're putting the eggs, what basket.
Yeah.
So that's something that I feel is very special. It comes out of this conversation today. Before I let you go, it would be a dishonor of mine to not allow you to mention everything you got going on, how people can work with you, and all that good stuff.
Best thing to do is go to my website initially, Ben Oofana, my name, benoofana.com. And you don't add my name, of course, just benoofana.com is the website. and and there's many resources, articles, videos are posted on my blog. And there is a contact form where you can message me. You can call my Google Voice number, leave a message. I will call you back, and that's 332-333-5155. There's a free ebook you can download if you're in the midst of a breakup, divorce, if your heart's being ripped out of your chest, if you're being going through some kind of heartrending drama relationally. It's just gettingoveryourbreakup.com. And our book, A Free Call, that link is refiningrelationships.com. And let's see what else. Yeah, that's the main thing. Just reach out to me. Also, you could find me on social media, YouTube, Instagram, Facebook. If you see me on Facebook or Twitter, you could see that I am unapologetically pro-democracy. So I'm not going to hide that. And some people that are more right-wing or right-leaning might find what I post a bit offensive, but I don't care. I'm, again, unapologetically pro-democracy. And, for me, being in Sri Lanka, India, and the war in Sri Lanka, I was in the midst of a lot of the craziness that was going on there. So I do, very pro-Ukraine and kick kick Russia out of Ukraine, definitely. So, you'll see what I'm passionate about there. But I post videos on YouTube, usually pretty consistently. But yeah, you could follow me there. I'll send you to the links. So you'll post that below the video.
Yeah, that'll end up in the show notes on the podcast and the video, all that good stuff. So it's been a pleasure. There was so many other topics that we could have got to. We'll have to connect again another time to explore a couple of different other avenues of conversation. But
Sure.
it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Would love to do that. Thank you, Mike.
Most definitely. Thank you.